Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, I rise today in strong support of the nuclear agreement with Iran. I do so because I believe this diplomatic achievement provides the only option that prevents Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. I'd like to take just a moment to say thank you to our negotiating team and commend them on a job that I believe was well done, and to thank them for their concerted effort to explain the agreement to the Congress over the past 2 months. I've been in this body for a long time. There have been many different agreements. I can never remember a time where this Senate has been briefed more assiduously than it has with this agreement. And as you know, Mr. President, we sat this morning for 2 hours and listened to the top heads of our intelligence agencies discuss with the particulars of this agreement. American negotiators have worked with negotiators from the world's major powers, the United Kingdom, France, Germany, China, Russia, and the EU, and reached an agreement that will prevent Iran from developing a nuclear weapon for at least the next 15 years, and I believe longer. I can't emphasize this enough. The agreement represents the world coming together to put an end to Iran's nuclear program. By contrast, if the Senate disapproves this agreement, we are on our own. As of last night, 42 senators have announced their support for the agreement. In practical terms, that means that the Senate will not disapprove this agreement. We have conducted a full review, and the opponents of this deal have failed. But the opponents are still holding out the false hope that there can be a better deal. Let me be clear, there is no better deal. No one, no state, no leader has proposed one. The only alternative to the agreement we now have is no agreement at all. Should the Congress reject this accord, the United States, which led this effort, would be deserting our allies and negotiating partners. That's because this is not just an agreement between the United States and Iran. It's an agreement between the world's major powers, the largest, most powerful nations in the world, and Iran. And it is the one approved by the 15 members of the United Nations Security Council. Brent Scowcroft, someone I know well, see annually, and the former National Security Advisor to President George H.W. Bush, recently wrote, and I quote, "There is no credible alternative were Congress to prevent U.S. participation in this nuclear deal. If we walk away alone," end quote. I think it may be helpful to remind my colleagues and the American people how we got where we are today. First of all, preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon has been a long-standing and bipartisan national security objective. In 2003, Europe led the first effort to halt Iran's nuclear program. The next decade saw 5 separate major rounds of failed negotiations and an ever-advancing Iranian nuclear program. Iran went from having a few centrifuges spinning to being a threshold nuclear power. Following the revelation that Iran was installing centrifuges at Natanz last decade, and disclosure in 2012 by our government and allies that Iran was turning a mountain near Qom into a deeply buried centrifuge chamber, Iran has seen sanctions escalate and felt international isolation. But its nuclear enrichment continued and advanced. The United States, with strong support from this chamber, led an effort to install devastating multilateral sanctions with the goal of bringing Iran to the negotiating table. Those sanctions were effective because they were supported by the world's powers and importers of Iranian oil. In fact, the United States doesn't do much business with Iran. We don't import Iranian oil, and United States banks don't process Iranian financial transactions. Unilateral United States sanctions are of little value by themselves unless we're willing to sanction allies' banks. Indeed, multiple UN resolutions, EU sanctions, and the cooperation of our partners and allies successfully pressured Iran over its nuclear activities. Over time, the international sanctions that we helped build and continually enforce reduced Iranian oil exports from 2.5 million barrels per day to less than 1 million, reduced the number of countries that import Iranian oil from 23 to 6, prohibited Iran from repatriating more than $100 billion in foreign currency, reduced Iran's GDP by nearly 6% in 1 year, caused major inflation, and basically ended international investment in Iran's economy. And the sanctions worked. Iran elected a reform government with a new president to negotiate an end to the sanctions and revive its economy. And despite its doubts, Iran sent a negotiating team to meet with the governments of the P5+1 nations. In November 2013, we signed the interim agreement that froze and even reversed Iran's nuclear program. Excuse me. According to the IAEA and verified by U.S. intelligence, Iran has abided by the interim agreement for more than 1.5 years now. As we all know, in July 2015, the P5+1 signed the final agreement, officially known as the Comprehensive Plan of Action. The agreement is the result of years of careful diplomacy among the world's powers. It was only possible because other nations abided by our sanctions at their own economic sacrifice. They believe that these sanctions worked, have achieved their result, and now should be suspended as Iran dismantles much of its nuclear infrastructure. These countries, which were so critical to our ability to impose sanctions, have told us directly they won't go back to the table to negotiate a new deal. To my colleagues who plan to vote in opposition to this agreement, I hope they've thought long and hard about what message this would send to the world. The consequences of rejecting this carefully negotiated deal would reach far beyond Iran. It would signal that the United States isn't willing or able to lead the world in confronting global challenges. Since the agreement was reached, I've spoken with many diplomats and statesmen. They're scratching their heads, wondering why the United States Congress is lining up with Iranian hardliners in opposition to this agreement, instead of siding with the UK, France, Germany, Russia, China, along with other members of the UN Security Council. Last week, Saudi Arabia announced its support for the agreement. Foreign Minister Adel al-Jubeir, who's known to many in this body, concluded his country's support by saying this: "This agreement will contribute to the security and stability in the region by preventing Iran acquiring a nuclear capability," end quote. During the August recess, a former head of state from one of our closest allies sat me down and said to me, "You know, we are one of the nations you trust the most. We follow U.S. leadership. We've agreed to the Iran deal, and now your Congress wants to back out. Why should we ever follow you again?" Many diplomats I've spoken with have echoed the former Prime Minister's statement. If Congress rejects the agreement, it's unlikely to follow us on other important issues in the future, and I believe the executive foreign policy obligations and responsibilities of a president of our country are diminished. Our ability to lead against global threats, to be the indispensable nation, I believe ends. I understand that many members of the Senate don't support our president, but by disapproving of this agreement, we also undermine the ability of any future president to speak for the United States and carry out his or her constitutional role in conducting foreign policy. I've been involved in national security issues for many years, and I can't recall a time in recent memory when the world was united to this degree on such a complex issue. Even Russia and China are with us. We shouldn't squander the opportunity. Many of my colleagues have already described the terms of the agreement and how it constrains and allows for intrusive monitoring of Iran's nuclear program. For me, the arguments of Secretary of Energy Ernie Moniz are particularly persuasive. As we all know, he's a distinguished nuclear physicist from MIT, and he played a central role in the negotiations. He's a true expert of unimpeachable integrity, and he knows the nuclear world. He has said over and over again, and I've heard it personally at least 5 times, that every pathway to a bomb, plutonium, uranium, and covert, is blocked by this deal. The agreement blocks Iran's uranium pathway to a bomb at Natanz and Fordo by reducing Iran's installed centrifuges by 2/3, from more than 19,000 to 6,000 for at least 10 years. It reduces Iran's stockpile of enriched uranium by more than 97% to no more than 300 kilograms of 3.67% for 15 years. Not enough nuclear material for a single weapon. It requires intrusive IAEA inspections of Iran's centrifuge production, their careful labeling and storage for 20 years. And it requires IAEA inspections for 25 years of Iran's entire nuclear supply chain. The agreement blocks Iran's plutonium pathway to a bomb at Iraq by modifying Iran's only heavy water reactor so that it cannot produce weapons-grade plutonium, and requires all spent fuel capable of being reprocessed for plutonium to be shipped out of the country. The agreement blocks Iran's covert pathway to a bomb nationwide by requiring 24/7 IAEA access to all of Iran's declared nuclear sites for 15 years. Empowering the IAEA to use its most advanced monitoring techniques and equipment to ensure Iran cannot tamper with its devices or evade nuclear monitoring. It guarantees IAEA access to any suspected nuclear site within 24 days, including military facilities, and providing access to all of Iran's nuclear sites under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty permanently. Most notably, the agreement imposes a perpetual prohibition against Iran ever seeking, developing, or acquiring a nuclear weapon. The terms of this agreement are unparalleled. The IAEA has never had this kind of access to any country. As the Vice Chairman of the Intelligence Committee, I can say we've looked at this issue very carefully. As you know, Mr. President, as late as this morning. I can say that if Iran doesn't comply with its obligations, we will know about it, and we will be able to snap back the sanctions that are suspended under this agreement. The administration has provided Congress with documents detailing the verification measures in this agreement. At an unclassified level, the executive branch has written, and I quote, "The United States is confident that it will be able to verify that Iran is complying with its commitments under the JCPOA, including its commitment not to pursue a nuclear weapon." The Senate has also received a classified annex to the assessment from the intelligence community, which I think some of my colleagues have reviewed, and I would hope everyone would. The Senate Intelligence Committee has met with the heads of the U.S. intelligence agencies, as I just said, as recently as this morning, to receive testimony and ask questions on our ability to ensure that Iran is complying with the terms of the nuclear agreement. From the reports and those hearings, I am very comfortable saying that the covert path to a bomb is closed, period. I recognize that this agreement doesn't address other problems the United States and international community have with Iran. Iran continues to support terrorist groups, prop up Bashar al-Assad, and undermine stability across the Middle East. It is a serial abuser of human rights and is improperly detaining American citizens. These are, of course, reprehensible policies, and of course we will continue to oppose them. But a nuclear-armed Iran would dramatically compound these problems. In my view, this agreement presents us with an opportunity to begin a broader discussion with Iran. As Iran hopefully will become more integrated into the global community, give up some of its bad ways, we can test whether Iran will move toward rejoining the community of nations. Rejecting this agreement only strengthens the hardliners who lead the chance of death to America. 88% of Iranians are under the age of 54. 41% are under the age of 25. They defied predictions and elected a moderate replacement to President Ahmadinejad in the hopes that Iran would chart a new course. Clearly, this agreement won't change Iran's behavior overnight, and it would be unrealistic to expect Iran's cooperation on every issue. But it would also be foolish to throw the opportunity away and to give the hardliners another reason to turn their backs on reform. More importantly, I am not willing to cede America's global leadership, to reject this nuclear agreement, or ignore the possibility of resolving the region's crises in favor of the myth of a better deal. There is no better deal. For these reasons, I join the large numbers of diplomats, scientists, retired U.S. flag officers, rabbis, arms control advocates, national security experts, and intelligence professionals in supporting this agreement with Iran. I urge my colleagues most sincerely to oppose the resolution of disapproval and support this historic agreement. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.